Memphis, Tennessee. December. On a rain-soaked auction block near the Mississippi River, something happened that would haunt the city's commercial elite for decades. A single slave, a young man whose physical appearance defied every convention of the trade, sold for a price so astronomical that it triggered a chain of events no one could have predicted. Within months, 3 of the wealthiest families in Memphis would be destroyed. Within a year, the buyer himself would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only cryptic journal entries that suggested he'd uncovered something far more dangerous than simple commerce. The city's newspaper archives from that period contain inexplicable gaps, entire weeks missing, as if someone systematically removed evidence of what truly transpired. What made this particular slave so valuable that men were willing to risk everything to possess him? What secrets did his sale conceal that powerful families would rather erase from history? Before we continue with the story of what became known in whispered circles as the Memphis Enigma, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about the antebellum South, and drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from our community across America. The truth behind this mystery begins not with the auction itself, but with the circumstances that brought this young man to Memphis in the first place. The spring of found Memphis in a state of commercial frenzy. The city had recently surpassed Louisville in cotton exports, and its position along the Mississippi made it the beating heart of the slave trade in the Western Territories. Auction houses lined Front Street like monuments to prosperity, their white columns gleaming in the southern sun, their interior halls echoing with the mechanical recitation of prices and the shuffling of human cargo. Among the city's elite, 3 families dominated the commercial landscape. The Harrington family controlled the largest cotton warehouses along the river. Edmund Harrington, patriarch and former Virginia aristocrat, had built his fortune through strategic marriages and ruthless business practices that left competitors bankrupt. His son, Charles, served as the family's public face, a handsome man of 32, who wore his privilege like a second skin, his every gesture calculated to remind others of their inferior station. The Dalton family, by contrast, had clawed their way up from modest circumstances. Jacob Dalton had arrived in Memphis 15 years earlier with nothing but a keen mind for numbers and an iron will. He'd established himself as the city's premier slave broker, the man who could procure any type of laborer a plantation owner might desire. His reputation for discretion made him indispensable to families who preferred their transactions to remain unrecorded in public ledgers. The third family, the Cavendish clan, represented old money from Charleston. Richard Cavendish had relocated to Memphis bringing with him not only substantial capital but also connections to shipping magnates in New Orleans and banking interests in New York. His wife Victoria hosted the most exclusive salons in the city, gatherings where business deals were sealed over imported wine and political alliances forged behind closed doors. These 3 families existed in a state of polite competition. Their rivalries carefully masked by social niceties, but beneath the surface tensions simmered. Each family sought advantage over the others, each searched for the investment or acquisition that would cement their dominance. It was into this environment that rumors began circulating in early November. A slave trader named Ambrose Fletcher, known for operating in the Carolinas and Georgia, had arrived in Memphis with an unusual acquisition. Fletcher was not well liked among his peers. He worked alone, avoided the established auction houses, and had a reputation for dealing in what other traders called specialty merchandise, slaves with particular skills or attributes that commanded premium prices from very specific buyers. Fletcher took rooms at a modest boarding house on Madison Avenue, far from the grand hotels where visiting merchants typically stayed. He made no attempt to advertise his wares, conducted no business at the public auction houses, and spoke to no one about what he'd brought to Memphis. This silence itself became the story. In a trade built on publicity and competitive bidding, Fletcher's discretion suggested something extraordinary. The whispers started in the gentlemen's clubs. A slave of remarkable appearance, not merely handsome, but possessing a beauty so striking that grown men stumbled over their words attempting to describe it. The rumors took on an almost mythical quality. Talk of features that seemed carved from marble, eyes that held an unsettling intelligence, a bearing that suggested nobility rather than bondage. Charles Harrington first heard about Fletcher's acquisition during a card game at the Memphis club. The man who mentioned it, a tobacco merchant named William Drexler, had apparently glimpsed the slave during a brief encounter on the street. Drexler described walking past Fletcher and his charge near the riverfront and finding himself so arrested by the slave's appearance that he'd actually stopped walking, causing the man behind him to collide with his back. "I've been in this business 20 years, Drexler had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen thousands upon thousands. Nothing prepared me for what I saw that afternoon. It wasn't just the face, Harrington. It was something else. Something in the way he moved, the way he held himself despite the chains. Like he knew something the rest of us didn't." Charles dismissed the story as exaggeration, the kind of tall tale men told after too much bourbon, but the description nagged at him. His father had recently expressed frustration with their household staff, complaining that none possessed the refinement appropriate to their social station. A slave of exceptional appearance, properly trained, could serve as a status symbol in the Harrington home, a conversation piece at dinner parties, a visible marker of the family's ability to acquire what others could not. Charles made inquiries. He learned that Fletcher was preparing to leave Memphis within the week, having apparently found no buyers interested in his unusual merchandise. The price being quoted, $3,000, was astronomical. A prime field hand rarely exceeded $1,500. An educated house slave might command $2,000. $3,000 suggested either madness or something genuinely exceptional. On a gray afternoon in late November, Charles Harrington arranged a private viewing. Fletcher received him in his boarding house room, a cramped space that smelled of lamp oil and river damp. The trader was a thin man in his 50s with the weathered skin of someone who'd spent decades traveling rough roads. His eyes held a calculating intelligence that Charles found immediately unsettling. "I appreciate discretion, Mr. Harrington," Fletcher said, gesturing to a chair. "Your inquiry came through appropriate channels. That speaks well of you." "I'm told you have something unusual," Charles replied, maintaining a business-like tone despite his growing curiosity. "I'm here to determine if the rumors justify the price." Fletcher smiled, a thin expression. That didn't reach his eyes. "The price is non-negotiable. I should make that clear from the outset. What I have is unique. I will not bargain, nor will I accept promises of future payment. $3,000, gold or bank draft, no exceptions. Then perhaps you should show me what justifies such confidence." Fletcher walked to an adjoining door and knocked 3 times. A moment later, the door opened, and Charles Harrington encountered the slave who would change his life. The young man who entered the room stood perhaps 6 feet tall with a slender but well-proportioned build. His skin held the color of honey touched by sunlight, suggesting mixed heritage, a common enough circumstance in the slave trade, though the specific combination of features here created something Charles had never witnessed. The face possessed a symmetry that seemed almost mathematical, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes of an unusual gray-green that seemed to shift color in the lamplight. But it was more than mere physical beauty. The young man moved with a fluid grace that suggested education, training, something far removed from the brutal world that had shaped most slaves. He wore simple clothes, cotton trousers and a white shirt, both clean but well worn. No chains, Charles noticed, no visible marks of restraint. The young man stood quietly, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his gaze directed at the floor in the expected posture of submission. Yet something in his bearing suggested the submission was performed rather than genuine, a role being played for an audience. "His name is Marcus," Fletcher said quietly. 23 years old, born in Virginia, educated in a manner I'm not at liberty to discuss. He reads and writes fluently in English and French. He has training in household management, bookkeeping, and music. He has never worked in the fields, never been subjected to harsh labor. His skin is unmarked, his health excellent. Charles circled the young man slowly, examining him as he would a piece of sculpture. Marcus remained motionless, his eyes still downcast, but Charles felt an almost electric awareness emanating from him, as though every nerve in the slave's body tracked his movement. "Let me see your hands," Charles said. Marcus raised his hands, palms up. The fingers were long and uncalloused, the nails neatly trimmed. Definitely not a field worker. The hands of someone who'd handled delicate objects, perhaps musical instruments or fine papers. "Look at me," Charles commanded. Marcus raised his eyes, and Charles felt a strange jolt of recognition, though he'd never seen this person before in his life. The eyes held intelligence certainly, but also something else, a weariness perhaps, or calculation. For just a moment, Charles had the unsettling feeling that he was being evaluated rather than evaluating. Why hasn't he sold? Charles asked Fletcher, breaking his gaze away from the slave. If he's everything you claim, why are you still in Memphis? Someone should have snapped him up immediately. Fletcher's expression darkened slightly. The men in this city lack vision. They see a pretty face and assume he's been kept as a pleasure slave. That he's damaged goods. They're wrong. But their prejudice has worked in your favor. You'll have the opportunity they were too foolish to take. What's his history? I need to know what I'm buying. His history is complicated. He was raised in a household that valued education, employed for years as a personal secretary. The family fell into financial difficulty and was forced to liquidate assets. I acquired him legitimately with proper documentation. Everything is legal and transferable. Something in Fletcher's tone suggested there was more to the story, details being deliberately omitted. Charles considered pressing the matter, but his mind was already racing ahead. The Dalton family had recently acquired a pair of twin house slaves, sisters who served as an exotic curiosity at their dinner parties. The Cavendish family employed a slave who could play piano and serve as entertainment during their famous salons. But this was something entirely different. A male slave of such striking appearance and obvious refinement would make Charles the envy of Memphis society. I'll need documentation, Charles said. Proof of ownership, transfer papers, everything legally required. Of course, everything is prepared. The question is whether you're prepared to meet my price. Charles studied Marcus one more time. The young man had returned his gaze to the floor, his posture unchanged. Yet Charles sensed a tension in him, as though he were a coiled spring waiting for release. What thoughts moved behind those unusual eyes? What did he think of this transaction, of being examined like livestock? The question surprised Charles. He'd bought and sold dozens of slaves over the years and never once considered their interior lives. $3,000, Charles said finally. I'll have the bank draft prepared. We'll complete the transaction tomorrow at my attorney's office. Fletcher nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Tomorrow then, 2 o'clock. Bring the draft and I'll bring the papers. Mr. Harrington, you've made an excellent decision. Marcus will serve you well. As Charles left the boarding house, he felt a strange mixture of excitement and unease. He'd just committed to the largest single purchase he'd ever made without his father's consultation. Edmund Harrington would be furious at first, but once he saw Marcus, once he understood the social advantage this acquisition represented, his anger would transform into approval. Charles was certain of it. What Charles could not know, as he walked back through the darkening streets of Memphis, was that he'd just set in motion a sequence of events that would destroy not only his own family but 2 others as well. The slave he'd agreed to purchase carried with him a mystery that would prove far more dangerous than beauty. The transfer of ownership took place exactly as arranged. Charles arrived at his attorney's office with a bank draft for $3,000 drawn on the Memphis Trust Bank. Fletcher produced documentation that appeared at first glance entirely legitimate: a bill of sale from a Virginia estate, transfer papers showing Fletcher's acquisition, and a letter attesting to Marcus's skills and character, signed by someone identified as Mrs. Eleanor Stratton of Richmond. The attorney, a cautious man named Horace Pembroke, examined everything carefully. He'd handled slave transactions for the Harrington family for years and prided himself on thorough documentation. Yet even he seemed slightly unnerved by Fletcher's intense scrutiny as the papers were reviewed. Everything appears in order, Pembroke finally announced. The provenance is clear, the documentation legally sufficient. Mr. Harrington, once you sign here, Marcus becomes your legal property. Charles signed without hesitation. Fletcher signed opposite. Money and papers changed hands. Marcus, who had stood silently throughout the entire proceeding, showed no visible reaction to his change in ownership. His face remained carefully neutral, his eyes fixed on some middle distance, his breathing slow and steady. One piece of advice, Fletcher said as he prepared to leave, his hand on the door handle. Marcus requires careful handling. He's not like other slaves. Treat him poorly and you'll find him difficult. Treat him with a measure of respect, not as an equal, you understand, but with acknowledgement of his capabilities, and he'll exceed your expectations. I know how to manage my property, Charles replied somewhat stiffly. Of course, Fletcher said, tipping his hat. He departed, leaving Memphis that same afternoon on a riverboat bound for New Orleans. He would never return to the city, and attempts to contact him in subsequent months would prove fruitless. Ambrose Fletcher, it seemed, had simply vanished from the slave trade entirely. Charles brought Marcus to the Harrington estate that evening. The family's home stood on Union Avenue, a grand Greek Revival mansion with 6 white columns supporting a broad front portico. The house had been designed to intimidate, to announce the family's wealth and status before visitors even crossed the threshold. Edmund Harrington had spared no expense on the furnishings: imported carpets, crystal chandeliers from France, furniture crafted by master carpenters in Philadelphia. Edmund's reaction to Marcus proved even more dramatic than Charles had anticipated. The elder Harrington, prepared to rage at his son's impulsive expenditure, found himself speechless when Marcus was presented to him in the main parlor. Edmund circled the young man just as Charles had done the day before, his expression shifting from anger to fascination to something approaching unease. "Extraordinary," Edmund murmured. "Charles, you may have actually demonstrated business sense for once in your life. I've never seen anything quite like this." Charles felt a surge of pride. "I thought he could serve as your personal secretary, handle correspondence, manage your calendar, serve at dinner parties. Imagine the impression he'll make on our guests." "Indeed," Edmund turned to Marcus. "Can you read complex documents, legal papers, financial statements?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his voice cultured and unexpectedly resonant. "I've handled such materials extensively in previous service. We'll put that to the test tomorrow. Charles, have him quartered in the East Wing, the room adjacent to my study. I want him readily available." The decision to place Marcus in such proximity to the family's private quarters raised eyebrows among the household staff. The Harringtons employed 16 slaves, kitchen workers, field hands for their property outside the city, house servants, and a coachman. All were quartered either in the basement or in separate buildings behind the main house. To give this newcomer a room in the East Wing, mere feet from Edmund's personal study and just down the hall from Charles's own bedroom, suggested a status unlike anything the other slaves had experienced. The head housekeeper, an older woman named Bess, who'd served the Harrington family for 20 years, expressed her concerns to Charles that first evening. "It ain't right," she said bluntly. "Putting him up there with the family. The others are already talking. They don't know what to make of him."